With the tyranny of the past 3 years of the COVID hysteria now finally seeming like it's somewhat coming to an end, even though we are now jumping once again into flu season, well, it appears that we have another tyranny on the horizon, and that may be the possibility of something akin to World War III. Well, even with something like the possibility of a global scale conflict over the hill, one thing we cannot do is drop the ball by allowing these tyrants to get off the hook when it comes to the nature of the horrendous things they were pushing upon the civilian populace of the world. We need to hold them to account and make sure that their feet are put to the fire. Let's go ahead and jump into the nature of the history of what they were trying to push with all of the heinous shit that was going on with vaccine mandates. From ABC News, say goodbye to the COVID-19 vaccination card. The CDC has stopped printing them. The once critical white COVID-19 vaccination cards are being phased out. Well, isn't that interesting? It only took them this long, October 4th, 2023, for the regime to admit that, you know what, this is a failed attempt. What we did was we tried to restrict your freedom with this arbitrary standard, much like many of the arbitrary standards we use. Also, we called it critical the entire time so we could propagandize you into a state of abject fear from this floating abstraction that we were telling you was a total threat to society, even though the death rate was less than 1%. Yes, I know. We're absolutely good people. What we see is, it says once critical, but I would argue nothing more than always arbitrary. And why I would say that is because we saw that it didn't stop the spread of COVID. It didn't stop it anywhere. Not in any of the states in the United States, not in any of the countries abroad that implemented any of these policies. Here's the thing that we see. Arbitrary standards did nothing. Whether it was social distancing, whether it was vaccine mandates, whether it was having to show your vax card, whether it was the process of having to wear masks. We did not see this stop the spread of COVID. In fact, it consistently proliferated across the entire planet. Now, what we see is now that COVID-19 vaccines are not being distributed by the federal government, the U.S. Center for Disease Control and Prevention has stopped printing new cards. Now let's look at this card. I remember when this all started, we were told one shot was all that was required. People like Rachel Maddow were selling the fact on the nightly news during the corporate press primetime hour, sitting there telling millions of people, if you get the shot, it has 100% efficacy, you cannot spread the virus. Well, we know that that's not true. The efficacy dwindled drastically, and we know that natural immunity is now far stronger to protect you from COVID than that of the vaccines. What do we also see? One dose was also a lie. We see even just looking at this card that they initially rolled out. Dose 1, dose 2, other, each of which having a month, day, and year, as well as the physician who would sign off for the fact that this is the person who gave you your vaccine. They lied initially because they knew that people would not be okay with acquiescing to the fact of getting 4 vaccines. And with this, what did they do? They consistently propagandized people endlessly so that they could get them into a mindset that they could sell them on nothing more than another arm of the pharmaceutical industrial complex and the government's plans to sit there and ramp up their profits. Because if you want to understand what's really going on, go ahead and look up the spiking of people like Moderna, Pfizer, and all of these other wonderful companies like Johnson & Johnson's profits when it came to the fact of what was announced with the different contracts that were going on with their production of these vaccines. Alrighty. The federal government shipped more than 980 million cards between late 2020 when the first vaccines came out through May 10th, according to the latest available data from the CDC. Federal and local health officials don't expect the discontinuation of the cards to be a particularly big change since the days of keeping them tucked in purses and wallets to ensure entry into festivals, bars, and restaurants are largely over. Pause. The fact that they just say this, that you needed to show any medical interventions that you had that was mandated by the government to enter into a festival, bar, or restaurant so you could go enjoy that of civil society is unbelievable. And they just sidestep it, act like it's not a big deal because the corporate press is the enemy of the people and they will never ever own up to their crimes, which is exactly what the people who perpetrated the hysteria of the COVID crisis on the people of the world are. They are institutional criminals of the highest order. Let's go ahead and jump into people who are defying institutional criminals, that being Greg Abbott. Texas Senate committee passes expanded ban on COVID-19 vax mandates. It's only the second day of the third special legislative session and a bill already advanced related to one of Governor Greg Abbott's priority items. A Senate committee approved a plan that would expand a ban on COVID-19 vaccine mandates, and I don't believe there should be a mandate for any vaccines whatsoever. You, as a free individual, have the right to make what decisions go into your body. Does not matter whether that is vaccines, drugs, I do not care. It is your right to make that decision. Now, what do we see from Axios? Companies are dropping their vaccine mandates. And what we see, the reason this is happening is because they no longer had the propaganda arm of the state to consistently gin people up into a active state of fear. And with that, people will revolt consistently, and we see that this is falling apart in mass. Some companies are rolling back mandates for employee COVID vaccination, but few are making official public statements about it. And why is that? Because they will have to own up to the fact that they operated as tyrants, and many of them will be questioned about if they were pressured by government to do so, which will further show the fact that the government was operating as a fascistic metric when it came to how they were handling the COVID hysteria. Why it matters. These moves signal that we've shifted into a new chapter of the pandemic, and when they say a new chapter of the pandemic is over. They're just going to keep using these different phrases to keep you in the mindset that you must stay afraid of the floating abstraction. Alrighty, and on to the floating abstraction and the fact of how much they propagandize people. They made people give their 6-month-old children vaccinations to make them free of the threat of COVID. But here's the deal. Anyone that was reading the data throughout the entirety of the COVID pandemic, whether it was from Norway, Israel, Finland, whether it was all of the stuff that was going on with the Great Barrington Declaration, the Johnson & Johnson studies, here's the thing. We saw that children were the group that was statistically basically non-affected from COVID, and no children died from COVID. None. It is quite literally almost a non-relevant factor when it comes to how heavily this affects children. And another thing I want to talk about is that we completely reoriented society based on what was best for the elderly and the adults, and with it, we completely avoided what was best for children. And it really says something about the mental health of a society that is willing to completely abandon what is best for future generations solely based on what they think is best in the now. The importance of COVID-19 vaccines for infants this fall. I'm not going to go into this. This article will be linked in the description down below as per usual, as will everything. I cannot go into enough words on YouTube because they will not allow me, because they will ban me. The feelings in my heart that I have towards the people that were willing to push experimental pharmaceutical procedures on children and do so with a smile, without hesitation, unfailingly. Moving on, we're going to go ahead and jump into the White House. Remarks by President Biden after meeting with the members of the COVID-19 response team. Well. I don't know if anyone remembers this, but this was just before winter, and it says, for unvaccinated, we are looking for a winter of severe illness and death for you. If you're unvaccinated, this is going to be tragic. For themselves, their families, and the hospitals, they'll soon be overwhelmed, but there's good news. If you're vaccinated and you've had your booster shot, you'll be protected from the severe illness of winter and death, period. The fact that Joe Biden starts this off by saying, I want to send a direct message to the American people, and then says, immediately, for the unvaccinated, you're going to suffer a severe illness of winter and death, which was proven absolutely false, but the degree of propaganda that these people were willing to stoop to and the level of fear-mongering should show you the degree with which they should never be trusted. No one in government that is actually willing to sit there and rule over anyone is a good person, because a good person has no desire to rule over other people. Alrighty, on to this article. It says, Biden announces sweeping vaccine mandates affecting millions of workers. The administration said that new mandates could affect around 100 million people, more than 2/3 of the U.S. workforce. This is not recent. This is September 9th, 2021. President Joe Biden on Thursday issued 2 executive orders mandating vaccines for federal workers and contractors, announced new requirements for large employers and healthcare providers, and he said would affect around 100 million workers, more than 2/3 of the U.S. workforce. And the thing that we need to talk about is that they mandated this for healthcare workers, the people who were already sitting there on the front lines fighting COVID, and then those healthcare workers who were taking care of the people that were being thrown into the hospitals en masse because they were so terrified and they were getting false COVID readings, as well as those people that were also assisting in blowing out the numbers. Well, what happened? We saw that these people who were the healthcare workers that were willing to sit there and during the time when the hysteria was at its highest, be on the front lines taking care of people who many people thought were going to die en masse and did not know if the people who were taking care of the ill were going to die. What did they do? The government deemed them completely inessential and told them, nope, sorry, you didn't go along with what we wanted with this medical procedure, this top-down mandate. We're going to have to fire you and call you inessential. They did exactly to them what they did to so many other people, ostracized them from the group when it comes to the public sector, and pointed at them, called them the bad guy, and said, they're the reason you're suffering. It really mimics that of the Soviet era. Let's go ahead and jump into Twitter, where we're going to be covering something from Justin Trudeau, and then we'll also be covering an article from The Guardian to finish this off, where we're talking about what happened with COVID vaccine mandates and mandates abroad when it was talking about all of the different stuff from multiple different countries. Let's go ahead and jump into this. From the Free Speech Union on Twitter, addressing Justin Trudeau's tyranny, data unearthed through an access to information request reveals 837 Canadians have been debanked over the past 5 years, including hundreds of those involved in the anti-vaccine mandate Freedom Convoy protests. Here's the deal. If Justin Trudeau and the tyrants in charge could have debanked absolutely everyone that went to those protests and took a part in standing up to the tyranny of what this absolute goblin wanted to push down on the people of Canada, I guarantee you he would have done it. Just like every one of the bureaucratic tyrants in the United States that was pushing the same standards as Justin Trudeau would have gleefully done the exact same thing to the citizens of the United States that defied the mandates. They would have debanked you, removed your ability to operate in civil society, gladly made it so you couldn't feed your children, and they would have stepped on with their day like nothing more had happened. On what we see is Kevin Bass, PhD, here January 7th, 2022, an Australian cafe owner who refused to enforce vaccine mandates was arrested by the police. That's right, 1 year ago in a free society, a Western man was arrested for refusing to discriminate against his own customers and violate their human rights. Absolutely evil. And this is pathetic, and that is absolutely what it is when you discriminate against someone because they do not have an experimental medical procedure that you deem fit. The thing is, that is removing people's ability to have bodily autonomy. And for so many people that claim to care so much about bodily autonomy and personal choice and your ability to do with your body what you desire, well, it's really contradictory. And something I want to play here that I already played once in my other video talking about COVID recently is something that Elon Musk posted, and it's a video, and what he says is, check out disinformation. And it's talking about the waning narrative when it comes to the efficacy of the COVID vaccine, and it's showing the numbers and the percentages of the efficacy dwindle in real time, showing the dates as well as showing how the narrative broke so consistently day by day throughout the entirety of the COVID hysteria ramping up. Let's go ahead and jump into that.
Shot. We've got to make sure we clarify that with people. It has nothing to do whether or not it's effective. We know it's highly effective. Highly effective.
We're going to be finishing off with this article from The Guardian, but just before we do, is that clip not incredible? Showing the narrative die in real time as you can see the efficacy numbers dwindle down consistently day by day. Unbelievable. Nothing more than that is needed, I would argue, when it comes to showing that the corporate press is nothing more than lying smear merchants that are trying to peddle you poison. Much like Michael Malice says, they are no better than tobacco executives that are trying to sell you poison. Alrighty. On what we see is, at a glance, COVID vaccine mandates around the world. Many countries have made inoculation mandatory for at least some of their citizens, with penalties for those who do not get jabbed. This was from November 9th of 2021, so we're not talking about right now. But what we are talking about is the standard that was set when it came to the precedent that was pushed amongst so many different countries when it came to the tyranny that was from the state when it came to removing your bodily autonomy with handling your approach to the COVID virus. Alrighty. The UK became the latest country to introduce vaccine mandates on Tuesday after the government announced all NHS workers are need to be jabbed by the spring. Obligatory shots have been ordered in many other countries. Some have balked at the measures and resorted to protests and legal action, which we saw consistently happen, which is what led to the Canadian trucker protests. In the US, which is struggling with very slow rates of vaccine take up, the Biden administration plans to get US companies with 100 or more workers to vaccinate their staff to bring in regular tests that have been opposed by Republicans and trade groups. Isn't that just something? The Biden administration, which through this mandate they were trying to get through OSHA, that any business or industry that had 100 employees had to mandate that those people get vaccines, which is so fascinating because the Democrats, being people that always talk about my body, my choice, are completely detached from it when it comes to the nature of my body, my choice. I have bodily autonomy. I do not want to take an experimental medical procedure. On Saturday, a federal appeals court in Louisiana temporarily halted the vaccine requirement for affected businesses. The administration says it is confident that the requirement will withstand legal challenges, in part because it is safety rules preemptive state laws. About 4 million federal workers are to be vaccinated by November 22nd under the president's executive order. Some employees, like those at the White House, are nearly all vaccinated, but the rates are lower at federal agencies, particularly those related to law enforcement and intelligence, according to the agencies and union leaders. On to Italy, we see it was the first country in Europe to make COVID-19 vaccines mandatory for healthcare workers, but amid rising cases and slower vaccination uptick, the debate is rising over the possibility of extending the obligatory requirement to other groups. And we saw that Israel had an incredibly high vaccination rate on top of countries like Italy. Italy hoping to hit its vaccine coverage of roughly 90% of the population. But what we saw was because Italy had such high rates of pre-existing comorbidities because so many of the people that live there are so old, we saw that their death rate was exponentially higher than many other countries that do not have as many old people as well as many people that are obese. Alrighty. On to New Zealand, we see that the New Zealand Parliament in Wellington on Tuesday took to protest against the government's vaccine mandates and government lockdowns. New Zealand has struggled to fight off highly infectious outbreaks such as the Delta variant, forcing the Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern to move to a strategy that is formed around eliminating through lockdowns to living with the virus with higher vaccinations. And here's the deal. Jacinda Ardern has since stepped down as the Prime Minister of New Zealand. She was nothing more than a tyrant, much like many of the people, like the governors that were restricting people's ability to have freedom of movement throughout the entirety of the COVID pandemic. Jacinda Ardern was someone who I would argue is also a drug addict. But again, conversation for a different day. And realistically, I don't care if she's doing drugs. The people in power are doing far worse things than doing bumps off their desk. At the beginning of October, what we see is the Canadian government said it would require all those working in the federal public service and federally regulated transport sectors to get vaccinated. Any core federal public servants, including members of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police who are unwilling to disclose their vaccination status or to be fully vaccinated, will be placed on administrative leave without pay from the 15th of November. On to France, we see they suspended 3,000 healthcare workers without pay for refusing the COVID vaccine. The health minister something, because I'm not even going to try, said that the staff had been notified in writing that the government imposed deadline to have it at least one dose in each arm. Barron said several doses is resigned rather than having the vaccine, but other than that, he estimated 2.7 million healthcare workers in France continued their healthcare, and he assured that they would be fine. Singapore, meanwhile, opted for a financial incentive to get people vaccinated along with that all the way up to December 8th. It will no longer pay the COVID-19 medical bills for people who are unvaccinated by choice. And Singapore being a place that has quote-unquote free healthcare, but realistically you're just taxed into the dirt so you can pay for that healthcare. Singapore is also a place with despotic rules and laws when it comes to the nature of drugs and how they will handle you if you are someone who brings drugs into their country. Onto this, what we see is the government currently covers the full COVID medical costs for all of Singaporeans, as well as all permanent residents and long-term visa holders. Singapore, like I said, having free medical care. Indonesia announced mandatory vaccination in February with heavy fines for those who do not comply. Indonesia really stepped up the ball, and the fact is they were like, you know what, every single person in this country has to be vaccinated. And the thing is, when you see government really mandating that every single person has to do something, you know it's never going to be good. And funnily enough, a perfect example of this would be Javier Milei, and this has nothing to do with anything to do with COVID, but Javier Milei in Argentina is living in a place where voting is mandatory. And what that means is every single person that is of the age has to cast a vote. And what happened? Javier Milei, being the libertarian anti-establishment candidate who is completely removed from the authoritarian standards of many of the people who have run for many of the offices throughout all of the world when it comes to the nature of government. Well, what do we have? We have the person in the place where voting is mandatory, who is an anti-establishment candidate, is the person who ended up being the man who is taking the lead in the actual primaries when it comes to the not Australian, the Argentinian presidential race. I will be making videos on that coming up soon. Javier Milei hopefully to be elected in Argentina to set the precedent to show that liberty is the standard that should be achieved. And with it, we see that that is something that we could learn from the United States, that liberty at all ends is the most important. And with that, if we had focused on that, we could have seen that the United States would not have fallen to tyranny the same way that we saw that it did throughout the entirety of the COVID madness. I'm going to go ahead and leave it there. Thank you for watching if you got this far. Thumbs up if you liked it. Thumbs down if you didn't. Subscribe if you like this kind of content. Really appreciate people watching. Thank you. Stay lovely. Stay great. Peace out.